Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into another earnings call analysis, doing what we do best.
That's right.
We're focusing on Invivyd, the biotech company, looking at their Q1 2025 results and what they see coming next.
Yeah, a really interesting one this time.
So the mission, as always, is to unpack the numbers, figure out their strategy shifts, see what's new in the pipeline, and definitely get into a pretty significant regulatory discussion they brought up. If you follow biotech or you're just curious how these companies handle market pressures, drug development, that whole FDA dance, well, this deep dive should be right up your alley.
Exactly. Think of it as seeing a company actively in transition. They're rebuilding their sales engine, pushing ahead with current products and new candidates.
And dealing with a shifting regulatory world.
Absolutely. It's complicated, and the call gave us some, really key pieces to that puzzle.
Okay, let's kick off with the basics. The Q1 2025 numbers, the quick snapshot.
Sure. So financially, Invivyd reported net product revenue for their antibody, PemevaBart, that came in at $11.3 million for the first quarter.
Okay, $11.3 million.
Yeah.
And cash position.
At the end of March, they had about $48 million in cash and cash equivalents. The bigger picture they painted was, well, Q1 revenue took a hit because of a strategic move we'll get into.
Right.
But they also really emphasized that they're continuing to cut operating expenses.
So revenue down short term, but costs also coming down. And that strategic shift, they made a pretty big change at the start of the year, commercially speaking.
They did, yeah.
Yeah.
Big decision. They decided to internalize their whole sales force, bring it all in-house starting January 1st.
Right.
And they were pretty upfront that, building that new team, training, getting them out there, that naturally slowed things down revenue-wise in Q1. It was building phase.
Makes sense. But they also sounded pretty positive about Q2 momentum. Did they give any signs that the shift is starting to work?
They did point to specific things, signs of acceleration. They even mentioned hitting their biggest commercial day and week ever early in Q2. So seems like things are picking up.
Okay, that's encouraging for them.
Yeah, and the key things they mentioned were, getting that in-house team fully established, focusing on accountability, tweaking their messaging to doctors.
And expanding their reach.
Exactly. They talked about increasing their commercial reach, specifically mentioning growth in infusion sites where PemevaBart is actually given. That's now over 880 across the U.S.
Wow, over 880. That's quite a network. Are they focusing on certain types of doctors with this new team?
Yes, definitely targeted. They mentioned focusing on specific specialists and specifically called out rheumatology. Seems like they're getting good traction there, good acceptance and adoption.
Rheumatology, interesting.
And they also talked about making headway on larger contracts with organizations wanting value from bigger orders.
Beyond just the logistics of sites and doctors, what about treatment guidelines? They mentioned getting included in some important ones. Why does that matter?
Oh, that's huge. It's really key for wider clinical use and, physician confidence. They highlighted being included in national pathways, protocols, guidelines, specifically mentioned IDSA, the Infectious Diseases Society of America, and also the NCCN guidelines, which are important for B-cell lymphomas. That's key because immunocompromised patients are a major group for PemevaBart.
Right. Connects back to the patient population. Now, PemevaBart is for COVID, which obviously has its waves. How are they thinking about seasonality?
They're planning for it. They mentioned the likelihood of a summer surge, especially maybe in southern states, and they're planning a targeted digital campaign to address that. They also mentioned a modest price increase back in March, though they noted it's still one of the lowest priced antibodies out there.
And CMS pricing update coming too.
Yeah, they said CMS would update its pricing in July.
All right, let's pivot from commercial to the science, the pipeline. How are they framing their work on new drug candidates beyond PemevaBart?
They kind of describe it as adding optionality, potential long-term growth, leveraging their core tech and know-how beyond just the initial focus.
Okay, let's start within COVID then. PemevaBart itself. What's the core story there?
So PemevaBart targets the RBD, the receptor binding domain on the spike protein. Their whole argument, and they really stress this, is that they hit a very stable spot, an epitope that hasn't really changed much, despite, as they put it, quadrillions of variants.
Quadrillions, wow.
So they argue this binding site is structurally stable, and that's why PemevaBart keeps working, keeps its potency stable over time.
Okay, stable target. Then there's VUID 2311. They called it next generation. Is it meant to replace PemevaBart because of variants or something?
Not exactly. They were pretty clear. It's not because PemevaBart is failing.
Right.
It's more like VYD2311 builds on the same foundation, the same structure or scaffolding, but they're trying to engineer in features that might be more attractive, medically or commercially. Like they specifically mentioned it has higher potency than PemevaBart.
Higher potency, and it's moving fast.
Seems like it. The first in-human study, looking at dose and route, is almost done. The potential upsides they see are things like maybe better accessibility, easier scaling for manufacturing, and potentially using it for treatment, not just prevention.
So less fixing a problem, more building a better mousetrap, potentially.
Kind of, yeah. Or one with different uses.
Okay. What about outside COVID? They mentioned branching out.
Yes, definitely expanding. First up, they talked about an RSV program.
Respiratory syncytial virus.
Exactly. They pointed out, it's a huge medical burden, especially for vulnerable groups like infants and kids.
Yeah.
And there's already a market there for prevention with antibodies like nirsevimab, palivizumab.
Right, Synagis and Beyfortus.
So their goal is to try and create a potentially best-in-class antibody targeting the RSV-F protein. They said expect an update later this year on that one.
Okay, RSV makes sense. But then they mentioned measles, which felt a little unexpected.
It did stand out, yeah. But they explained their thinking. Measles apparently shares some features with COVID and RSV, like the need for broadly acting antibodies because of variants.
Okay.
And they also pointed out the target is validated. We know targeting it works because the MMR vaccine is so effective, and things like IVs are used after exposure.
So what's the goal with a measles antibody?
They're aiming for a tool that could be used for actual treatment of measles and for post-exposure prophylaxis. Giving it after exposure to prevent bad outcomes, and pre-exposure prophylaxis, preventing it beforehand. They said expect an update on measles before the end of this year, too.
Treatment and prevention. Interesting. Did they touch on flu at all?
Just briefly, they have some low-intensity influenza work going on, but interestingly, they specifically said they've shifted some focus away from flu, partly because, in their words, there have actually been more U.S. deaths from measles outbreaks recently than from avian flu.
Wow, really? That puts it in perspective.
Yeah, it really shows how, real-time public health signals can directly shape R&D decisions for a company like this.
Okay, that leads us perfectly into the regulatory side, always critical for biotech. And Invivyd spent a fair bit of time on this, right?
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
Any biotech success hinges on navigating regulators like the FDA.
And they started by mentioning kind of changing environment, new leadership at HHS, FDA, maybe more transparency coming.
Right. And they definitely practiced what they preached on transparency by detailing a very specific, and I think pretty significant, regulatory interaction.
Which was?
It was the declination they received from, and they specifically called it the legacy Biden FDA.
Meaning the FDA under the previous setup.
Exactly. The declination was for their application to expand the emergency use authorization, the EUA, for PemevaBart. They wanted it to cover treatment of active mild to moderate COVID, specifically in immunocompromised people who didn't really have other options left.
Okay, so trying to help a very vulnerable group with no alternatives, and the FDA, under that prior leadership, said no to the EUA expansion. What was the FDA's main reason?
According to Invivyd's retelling of the FDA's communication, the core finding was that the agency just couldn't reasonably conclude that the known or potential benefits outweighed the risks, specifically for that use case under the EUA standard.
Okay, benefit risk didn't cross the bar for them in that context. Did they break down the specific scientific issues the FDA raised? And Invivyd mentioned 4 points, I think.
Yes, they did. They laid out the FDA's scientific conclusions as they understood them. First point, the FDA felt PemevaBart's antibody titers, basically how much functional antibody is in the blood, were similar or maybe higher than another antibody at intravomab for only about 3 days. Then they dropped lower.
Okay. So a concern about how long the drug level stayed high compared to another drug. What was next?
Second, the FDA apparently stated that PemevaBart wasn't among the most potent antibodies developed for SARS-CoV-2. Potency is about, how little drug it takes to neutralize the virus in the lab.
So not top of the potency charts. Got it. Third point.
Third, the FDA apparently saw residual clinical uncertainty about the optimal dose of PemevaBart, specifically for the severely immunocompromised patients. They felt maybe the dosing wasn't quite nailed down for that really vulnerable subgroup.
Okay, dose uncertainty. And the last point.
The fourth one was maybe the trickiest. The FDA suggested that other antibodies, like that comparator adintrevimab, might have subtle differences in how they work beyond just neutralizing the virus. maybe engaging other parts of the immune system, what's called effector function. The FDA seemed to hint that maybe PemevaBart lacked something other antibodies had for this specific use.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty technical set of reasons. So how did Invivyd respond? They didn't just accept that, presumably.
Well, definitely not. They had detailed counter-arguments for each point. On the titers, they said, well, we see the data showing comparable or higher levels for 4 days, not 3.
Okay, a day's difference, but maybe significant.
And yeah, they conceded the levels settled below an intravomab after that, but they stressed those levels were still way better than nothing, which was the alternative for these patients. They also argued that focusing on just 5 days is relevant. Paxlovid's a 5-day course. Early treatment benefit happens in that window.
Right, framing the comparison differently. What about the potency point, not being the most potent?
They acknowledged it, yeah. It's not number one, but they argued its potency is well within the range that's been proven effective clinically for other antibodies. They even pointed out it's more potent than sotrovimab, which did get an EUA and was used effectively.
Ah, okay, so context matters.
Exactly. Their point was basically, being the absolute most potent might not even matter that much clinically after a certain threshold. Maybe there are diminishing returns just chasing higher potency numbers in the lab.
Interesting point, and the dose uncertainty and those subtle mechanism differences.
On dosing, they basically framed the FDA's uncertainty as, well, unfortunate for patients who desperately need something. And regarding those subtle mechanisms, they said, look, we actually measured effector function, and it was essentially identical between PemevaBart and adintrevimab, which makes sense given their similar structures.
So they checked that box.
Yeah. And as for unknown mechanisms, well, they pointed out that's kind of hard to assess for anyone. They even had a slightly humorous line about welcoming FDA guidance on what unknown things they should measure next time.
Huh, okay. So clearly a pretty strong disagreement on the science and the interpretation. What's the path forward now, regulation-wise, especially with the new FDA leadership in place?
They plan to keep talking to the new FDA leadership about both PemevaBart and VYD2311, but crucially, they really want to move past the whole EUA framework.
Towards a full approval.
Exactly. Pursue a full biologics license application, a BLA, for PemevaBart. They highlighted that they have unique, contemporary efficacy data from a randomized controlled trial, which they see as a strong asset for a BLA.
A BLA is definitely a higher bar than an EUA. How do they see that fitting the current stage of the pandemic?
They actually see the current endemic situation as an opportunity. They think it's time to normalize towards something like an accelerated approval pathway.
Like with the vaccines?
Yeah, possibly with a post-market study requirement. They feel that framework fits their situation and data well.
And does the data they have for the next-gen antibody, VYD2311, help address the FDA's specific concerns about PemevaBart?
They think so. They presented data showing VYD2311 at the doses they're studying gives antibody titers much higher than adintrevimab, even getting close to or exceeding the levels seen with Regenkov, which was known for high titers.
Okay.
So they believe that directly tackles a lot of the concerns the FDA raised about PemevaBart's titer levels in that earlier comparison.
Seems like they're trying to cover their bases there. Did they mention any other regulatory moves?
Yeah, one more thing. They filed a citizen petition with the FDA.
Okay, what's that about?
It focuses on what they see as a kind of gap or inconsistency in the requirements between different FDA centers that handle COVID products, CBER for vaccines, CDER for antibodies like theirs. They're basically arguing for some regulatory evolution there.
Interesting angle.
And they also plan to publish a scientific paper laying out this whole PemevaBart treatment declination story, essentially making their case in the scientific literature.
Okay, putting it all out there. Let's circle back then to the money side, the financials and outlook after that deep regulatory dive.
Right.
We mentioned they cut operating expenses in Q1. How much were we talking?
So OPEX in Q1 2025 was $27.4 million. That's down 15% from Q4 2024, which was $32.3 million.
And Q4 was already down significantly from Q3, right?
Hugely, over 50% down from Q3 to Q4. So yeah, this has been a really sustained effort to tighten the belt.
Do they expect costs to keep falling?
They do, yes. They anticipate OPEX will decrease further in Q2. A big reason is they feel they have enough PemevaBart and VYD2311 manufactured and on hand for now.
So less near-term manufacturing spending hitting the P&L?
Exactly. That should help keep operating costs down in the near term.
And what about their cash runway or access to more funds?
Well, besides the $48 million cash they had end of March, they also secured access to up to $30 million more through a term loan facility they finalized in April. And importantly, They stressed this is non-dilutive funding.
Meaning they don't have to issue more stock.
Right. No dilution for existing shareholders, which is always good news for investors.
So pulling that financial picture together, what's the bottom line goal they're aiming for?
They reiterated their main focuses: grow PemevaBart revenue with that new internal sales team, keep up the strict financial discipline on costs, and they're targeting profitability by the end of the first half of 2025, so quite soon.
Okay, profitability target insight. So for you listening, trying to piece this all together, what's the big takeaway from this whole Invivyd story presented on the call?
I think it really paints a picture of just how many different things a biotech company juggles, right? It's not just the cool science in the lab.
Right.
You see the grind of building a commercial operation, the complexities and sometimes conflicts of dealing with regulators, the strategic choices about which diseases to target next, and underpinning it all, the constant need for sharp financial management, especially when funding is tight.
It's the lab, the market, the FDA, the bank account, all interacting.
Exactly. All while trying to actually help patients and address public health needs. It's a tough balancing act.
Okay. Which brings us to our favorite disclaimer moment. This is not financial advice.
Absolutely not. We're just analyzing the information Invivyd shared on their call. This is purely for information, maybe some entertainment. Definitely not advice on buying or selling anything.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But with that firmly stated, let's indulge in a little thought experiment. Purely based only on what we heard on this call, let's try an outrageous but plausible idea, just for fun.
All right, lay it on me. Strictly call-based.
Strictly call-based. Okay, so the company stressed capital discipline over and over. They strategically added programs. They specifically highlighted measles as a new area.
Yeah, the unexpected one.
Right. And they linked it to recent U.S. deaths, mentioned potential national interest, maybe strategic partners. So here's the outrageous idea. Forget COVID for a second. What if you took a super speculative position based only on the potential for some future wins, specifically in that measles program, like hitting an early discovery milestone or announcing a partnership?
Okay, that is out there. Why is it outrageous?
Because measles just isn't the hot topic in biotech right now, you know? It feels like betting on a horse nobody's really watching compared to the next COVID variant or cancer drug.
Fair point. So why is it plausible, sticking just to the call?
Plausible because they made a point of highlighting it. They gave a public health rationale, the recent deaths. They explicitly mentioned potential partners and national interest. For a company so focused on careful spending, landing, say, some non-dilutive funding or showing really promising early data for a program like measles, one that maybe has less competition right now, could potentially have a much bigger positive impact on their valuation than you might expect, given their size and focus on lean operations.
So a high-risk bet on a dark horse they themselves introduced.
Exactly. A bet totally detached from the immediate COVID commercial and regulatory challenges, banking on an unexpected positive surprise from this new program they flagged.
Interesting angle. Again, purely hypothetical, derived only from the call's narrative.
Precisely. Just shows how listening closely can spark these kinds of imaginative, if definitely speculative ideas.
Right.
So wrapping up this deep dive on Invivyd's Q1, what's a final thought you think listeners should maybe chew on?
I think it comes back to that core tension we saw played out. The FDA's necessarily rigorous, sometimes slow-moving process versus the really urgent, immediate needs of patients, especially those immunocompromised folks with zero other options. It also makes you think about the value of that disciplined, capital-smart approach in drug development today.
Can lean and mean win?
Maybe. And it shows the need for adaptability, pivoting, or adding things like measles based on what's actually happening with public health. Kind of leaves you wondering, what else could their scientific platform do? Not just for the obvious targets, but maybe for the unexpected ones down the road.